When the French architect Adam François Gommard visited Egypt at the beginning of the 18th century and saw the Egyptian monuments. For the first time in his life he stated, "We are really stunned by the ancient Egyptians' ability to deal with megaliths. That even gigantic monuments are a monolith. Starting from cutting, transporting, then lifting them up to their destinations despite the difficulty of collecting hundreds of tight stones that weigh tens and even hundreds of tons. It was but a simple daily routine for them. How could they deal with such gigantic stones so effortlessly? A question that floated over the mind of millions of people over the years. In 1974, a French chemist called Joseph Davidovits could successfully develop a method to make artificial stones through chemistry. One day, he was sitting with a friend at the Museum of the Natural History in Paris. Joking, he wondered, what if we buried one of my artificial facts? And it is discovered after 3,000 years by someone, what would they supposedly think? His friend answered, it will be traced back to the nearest red granite quarry, which will almost be either in Cairo or in Aswan. A specific idea sparkled in Joseph's mind at that moment. Ancient Egyptians could have probably used a similar technique in building the obelisks, the pyramids, and the temples. This is, particularly, the question that we will attempt to answer today. Can it be the way through which ancient Egyptians built their monuments? Giant stones, carved or artificial? Davidovits is, at first place, a French chemist, and his most important contribution is developing a new technique known as the geopolymer. Geopolymer is, shortly, a way of making artificial stones that are almost identical to natural ones. And the idea is primarily based on bringing the stone powder from the quarries. Then, it is put in molds. Other natural components that are easily found are then added. These components act as a glue that ties rock particles together and makes it into a defined mold, either as a block, a statue, or something else. Joseph believed that ancient civilizations made their stones synthetically, and believed if his idea was true, that would give a clue for many mysteries, such as the tremendous weights of the stones, and the hardness of the monuments, as you then will need to cut and transport stones instead. It will be formed on site. This way can explain how the pyramids were built, a big challenge that stands still up to our day. Taking in consideration the failure of all these building trials, his trial couldn't move forward, not even for one step, without getting samples of the stones and examining it. Joseph contacted the French Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer and explained his idea. Jean-Philippe said that he is reticent to this idea yet. I will help you. He gave Joseph 2 samples of the pyramid's limestone, one from the casing stone of Teti, and the other was from the Great Pyramid's interior. The samples were taken and examined by Joseph in the laboratory by X-ray and the electronic microscope that reveals the smallest details. He discovered that one of these samples contains teeny tiny air bubbles and a string of fiber. Of course, under the rays, a black line appears, and he assumed that it was a hair that fell during making this stone. These 2 points made him believe that he was close to a great discovery, as such things can never exist in natural stones. Then, Joseph traveled to Egypt to make further analysis through taking samples from Khufu's pyramid and one of the small pyramids neighboring to Menkaure Pyramid. When these samples were compared to the famous pyramid's quarries, it was discovered to have more silicon and calcium than those in the natural quarry stones. Where does this extra percentage of silicon and calcium come from? He deduced that other components should have been added to the stone and changed its structure. These were his findings. It started to be clear in his mind. This was his idea. The quarries from which the stones were taken are located close to the plateau. This plateau gets submerged by Nile flood for 3 months every year. After the end of the flood, water recedes, leaving the stones crumbled, so workers can easily collect and transport it to the site. Then wooden molds are made, and other available natural materials are added, such as natron salt, caustic soda, magnesium chloride salt, lime, and other materials that get all meet and left to dry. A few hours later, the mold is removed, and the stone block is shown. Joseph set his equations upon his analysis. The next step was to carry out an experiment to reproduce the stones. After the end of the flood, water recedes, leaving the stones crumbled. So workers can easily collect and transport it to the site. Then wooden molds are made, and other available natural materials are added such as natron salt, caustic soda, magnesium chloride salt, lime, and other materials that get all mixed, and left to dry. A few hours later, the mold is removed, and the stone block is shown. Joseph set his equations upon his analysis. The next step was to carry out an experiment to reproduce the stone. In the summer of 2002, he made an experiment in France through which he used the geopolymer technique to build a pyramid. He got the needed limestone from a quarry in France. As you can see, he made a small structure of several stones that weighed 15 tons in total. By this experiment, he excelled many others who introduced only unproven theories about building the pyramids. Challenging others, he sent 2 samples of his artificial stones to 2 famous geological labs in France to prove his idea. He didn't give them any details about his experiments. After carrying the required analysis, the lab sent him 2 reports, stating that all the stones are of natural, non-artificial, components. Yet, the stones still contain about 10% of artificial ingredients to be discovered. These samples need spectroscopic analysis, which is a really advanced process. This analysis wasn't applied by the lab because they didn't doubt the stones to be artificial. If 2 of the biggest French labs couldn't discover the artificial components, then geologists and archaeologists won't be able to discover it, as well. Discussing his idea in some conferences and academic papers, other scientists and scholars started to investigate it, doing their own researches to validate it. Yet, before discussing these studies, there are some points in Joseph's idea that have stopped me and made me rethink and even doubt it for not taking everything for certainty first. After getting the results of the 2 samples, Joseph declared the result of only one. He did not mention the result of the second sample, despite its importance. Also, for the samples taken from Giza Plateau, he mentioned that he took 5 samples from the Great Pyramid, and another small one. Although he was supposed to take these samples from the 3 main pyramids of Giza, the question here is, why did he ignore the biggest and the most complex pyramids and selected another small and easily built one? I think that the reason is that he decided to ignore the results. That contradicts his idea. The idea of artificial stones is partially true. The pyramids might contain some artificial stones, but this is not the case with all of the stones. Yet, he offered the details that match his view but did not consider the rest. This will be proven through the following studies on which he depended in proving his idea true. He has, for example, offered a study made in 2012 in association with other 2 scientists. From Egypt, Professor Ibrahim Al-Himali, whose current position is the head of the Department of Magnetism in the National Institution of the Geophysical and Astronomical Research, and Professor Igor Toni from Slovakia. The study investigated the paleomagnetic of the pyramid stones. It checked whether these stones were artificially made and poured. In this case, they are supposed to have a stable parallel magnetism from north to south. But, if they were cut from the quarry, their magnetism should have been altered because after cutting, these stones are always rotated, lifted and so on. After the study, they took 6 samples from Khufu and Khafre pyramids. 3 of these samples were discovered to have a similar polarity, while the other 3 are different. Then, the similar 3 stones might be artificial. But what is it for the other 3? Are they natural ones? The results revealed that the pyramid might contain some artificial stones side by side with other natural ones. In his book, Joseph referred to only 3 stones with equal magnetism. He didn't declare it to be carried on 6 stones, though. All should be mentioned. In November 2020, a documentary entitled K-19 was made. It got widely popular in no time. The movie adopted Joseph's experiment on artificial stones. T stated that all of the pyramid stones are artificial because they have the same magnetism based on drive, Ibrahim's study. And it can definitely assign this result incorrect because the whole study is based on investigating only 6 stones, 3 of which were found to be natural, while the other 3 seem to be geopolymers. In contacting Dr. Ibrahim Al-Himali, the main researcher of the published paper we are investigating now, we discussed some details, and he told me that he wishes to generalize the experiment. The ministry can, for example, adopt a project through which 100 different samples of the stones of the pyramids are investigated. The results then can be more trustworthy. Finally, in 2006, a chemist called Michael Barsom carried a 3-year study on 13 sample stones, 7 of which were from the pyramids, and the other 6 were from the quarries. He did many different investigations. The conclusion was that chemical interference was applied on some of the pyramid stones. This is particularly why it is different from those from the quarry. He declared his deep admiration of this technique, through which the stones were produced, to be not only semi-natural but also resistant to the different climatic conditions. He said, the ancient Egyptians were not only exceptional civil and architectural engineers, but also superb chemists and material scientists. They would also have to be credited with the invention of concrete, thousands of years before the Romans, that a lime-based cement, cast and cured at room temperature, would survive for 5,000 years. While the best our civilization has to offer, Portland cement, which under the best of circumstances lasts 150 years or less. According to the previous study, the causeway to Khafre's pyramid is obviously molded, and many odd elements, that are not basically common in quarries, were found in it. The ground around the pyramids also reminds us of the concrete foundation mostly common nowadays. It wouldn't be very practical for the builders to make that from the quarried stones, and it is already chemically prepared according to the analysis. The casing stones, on the other hand, were natural. They were tightly glued together with strong concrete. If it had been molded, it could have needed no glue to be tightened together. Yet, the stones of the flat part might have made this way. According to the analyses, Joseph offered some texts and inscriptions to support his idea. His first proof was the signs of the ancient hieroglyphs. Here is a sign of hieroglyphs taken from Gardner's dictionary. It represents a person staking stones, and it means build. And another sign was of a person making a mixture, which also means building. The same way is still used nowadays in preparing the concrete mixture. This might symbolize the geopolymer mixture used in building the pyramid. It might also represent the preparation process of the gypsum mortar used between the stones. Both scenarios are equally possible. Joseph used a stele from the Louvre as another proof. The stele represents a person called artisan, who was the chief of the manufacturers and craftsmen. The stele has been translated over and over again by various European experts. We retranslated also some words by Mr. Abdallah Salem. In one of its parts, artisan states, I know how to make objects in molds, balance parts and do accurate calculations, without letting the fire burn them. In his translation in the 60s, Alexander Badawi uses the word cemented objects. Far before Joseph's thesis, Joseph viewed molded cement as a proof of stone manufacturing the same way we act. Today he also cited an important engraving from the tomb of Recameras, vizier of Thutmose III. It, actually, dates back to thousands of years before building the pyramids, yet it represents a group of workers making a mixture that looks exactly like that known today as the cement concrete. It is, therefore, considered as a pictorial image of an already existing way used by ancient Egyptians. Those were Joseph's proofs because it is claimed that there are no text evidence. No, there are some texts that prove his idea, but they are sometimes ignored. One of the religious proofs introduced by Joseph was Khnum's drawing. In the ancient Egyptian religion, Khnum was represented as a human with ram head. According to ancient Egyptians' beliefs, Khnum is the one who first created man from mud. It was worshipped in the north, and it was frequently portrayed as forming man's shape using pottery wheel. One of Khufu's selected names of Khnum Khufu, which means Khnum protects me. Joseph signaled the connection between Khnum and Khufu's names as a reference to the way the last used in building the pyramid. The process of creation from mud. Please notice that I am just explaining Joseph's way of thinking. Thus, we have cited 4 of Joseph's proofs. Some of them are laboratory and measurement proofs. They have already been tested through X-ray, electric microscopes and measuring the rocks. Magnetism, Another proof was making an artificial rock in his lab, and the way he claimed other proofs were either linguistic or religious. What is the defect in this way, then? First, the size of the pyramid stones is multiple, heterogeneous, and unflattened. This, in turn, reveals some weakness in his thesis, because if they were made in molds, they must have been flattened or similar. At the same time, it is not reasonable to make a mold for each stone. Michael Barsoom, the author of the published paper, believes that it is not logic for all of the pyramid stones to be artificial, because they are different in size, on one hand, and will cost an extreme amount of wood to make the patterns and the chemical heating. On the other, this will exceed Egypt's resources of wood, as a country with limited wood resources. He, therefore, believes that it is only partially applicable. Second, the quarry in front of Khafre's pyramid. Joseph's theory suggests that workers used to get stones crumbs from the quarries and mix them together to make a giant stone, yet the quarry implies something else, that some of the pyramids megalithic have been cut from here. Yet, Joseph replied that this has nothing to do with the pyramids. He pointed to an inscription on the wall of the quarry as an evidence that this quarry belonged to King Ramses-Il. The inscription stated the overseer of His Majesty Ramses-Il, in his palace, the noble, son of overseer, in Waset, Thebes, but this doesn't mean that the whole quarry was his, as he used to put his name on structures and sites that he didn't build. Furthermore, he used the base stones of Khafre's pyramid to build a temple in Memphis. He was, particularly, famous for this practice. Thus, to recap, geopolymer stones might have been, partially, used in building the pyramids and other structures. This is undeniable, especially after the analysis given by some labs stating that these stones contain chemical materials. At the same time, this is not, exclusively, the only way used in building the pyramids. For example, we still follow different building styles, nowadays. The problem here is generalization. Joseph generalizes this way on all of the stones. Joseph generalizes this way on all of the stones, while Egyptologists totally deny it. However, the answer is that it is partially used in making some of the stones. This is an undeniable chemical analysis that can only be deconstructed by other chemical analyses. A frequently asked question here is, doesn't this match the Quranic narrative told by the Pharaoh? Before giving any answer, please notice that it was Joseph's question on page 89. He mentioned the following Quranic phrase, Sefer, Pharaoh declared, O chiefs, I know of no other God for you but myself. So bake bricks out of clay for me, O Haman, and build a high tower so I may look at the God of Moses, although I am sure he is a liar. Briefly, the Pharaoh asked Haman, the minister, to heat mud so as to build a structure on the top of which he can look into Moses' God, and I think he is a liar. Based on this ayah, Joseph stated that the structure meant here is the pyramid, another proof that might support his theory. Sefer, the whole thing here is not true, because heated mud is significantly common in all ancient civilizations across history. The Lahun Pyramid, for example, is made of mud. Other buildings in Saqqara, around Dandara, Luxor, Edfu and Sinai are all made of mud. Heated or dried mud is very common as a building material. It is frequently used. It is still that common in Egyptian villages. Burned mud, therefore, isn't exclusively relevant to the pharaoh. Moreover, the pharaoh wanted to build an immense structure so as to look into the heavens. Why would he need 3 structures with multiple passages, rooms, and granite stones to look for Moses' God? The link between the structure and the pyramids, therefore, isn't correct yet. Having some weaknesses doesn't mean that the whole theory is wrong. We always look for the correct parts anyway. Davidov's theory got widely spread, and gained as much supporters as opponents. The supporters tended to view each single thing in the ancient civilization as casted. The opponents, including the archaeologists and the academics, went so far in their opposition they viewed Davidov's theory as a mere illusion regardless his published results, equations, and experiments. Dr. Zahi's reply was bare of any details. In his interview with the New York Times, he said, The idea that the stones of the pyramids were synthesized is impossible and unproven. The pyramids have been restored several times with extensive use of concrete, and I would like to ask a question. Where did Joseph Davidovits get the samples he used in his research? How can we check that the samples were not taken from the newly restored areas? Dr. Zahi was talking about stones that got renovated in the 20th century. Modern concrete in 20th century. Joseph's reply was, I hope to face serious adversaries, those who take ideas one by one. They viewed Davidovits' theory as a mere illusion regardless his published results, equations, and experiments. Dr. Zahi's reply was bare of any details. In his interview with the New York Times, he said, the idea that the stones of the pyramids were synthesized is impossible and unproven. The pyramids have been restored several times with extensive use of concrete, and I would like to ask a question. Where did Joseph Davidovits get the samples he used in his research? How can we check that the samples were not taken from the newly restored areas? And refute them in scientific and methodological means. In geology, chemistry and hieroglyphs, but all I received were farcical studies and pitiful reviews. From people who had one thing in common, they haven't seriously studied my theory, as well as adopting a rejectionist preconceived notion instead of criticizing what I've done. This was Joseph Davidovits' idea, published in a book entitled They Built the Pyramids. A few years later, he published a modern version of the book, entitled, Why Did the Pharaohs Build Thane Pyramids with Fake Stones? Could this idea solve the mystery? As we argued up there, it is proved that artificial stones are partially used, yet there are still some obstacles. The body of the pyramids itself, for example, consists of uneven quarry stones. The lower rooms of the pyramids are assumed by K-19 movie to be constructed by concrete cast, so as to offer a clue to the mystery of the passages, the darkness and the lack of oxygen. Yet, this thesis can easily be deconstructed because the upper and the lower walls are not homogeneous. One is carved, while the other is built. Thick wooden logs are found interjected in the walls of some rooms of the pyramids. Meidum's pyramid, for example, contains some of those wooden logs. Many theories, including K-19 movie, refer to those logs as a proof of using artificial stones in building the pyramids. They argue that those wooden logs are introduced during the concrete cast, yet, with neat investigation, one can notice that it is not directly interjected into the stones. Another layer of cement oblast was found around the wooden logs. This means that the stone was, first, emptied. Then, the hole was filled with a mixture and the sticks were interjected into it. Some people submit Wadi al-Gharf's papyrus as a proof of the cutting process. They assume that the cutting was carried out in the quarries. The details of Wadi al-Gharf's papyrus will be discussed later in another episode, yet, up to this moment, we should notice that Wadi al-Gharf's papyrus didn't mention the technique followed in cutting the stones. If this is true with sedimentary stones, what is it for granite rocks then? All volcanic rocks such as red granite, black granite, and basalt, and other hard stones such as the diorite and the granodiorite are all out of the theory of the geopolymer. Joseph, himself, states this. He stated that the geopolymer method wasn't used with granite stones. Joseph stated in his book that the geopolymer method wasn't used with granite stones. Joseph, himself, didn't prove that granite was made from geopolymer, yet those who came after Joseph insisted that it was made this way. They suggested that granite was melted by giant lens that concentrate the solar energy and melt it to its primary form, lava, then it is poured in patterns so as to form giant granite stones, huge statues, or heavy obelisks. We have to check this thesis. In order to carry this process out, we need wide lens. In addition, any substance that will be exposed to concentrated sun rays shall get either melted or burnt. A paper shall get burnt. Wax or plastic will get melted. Because concentrated sun rays upraise the temperature of the substance, L could only get a 60 cm lens, but it couldn't melt the granite. Granite needs lens of at least 1.5 meters diameter to get melted. Other people carried other experiments on granite using lens with bigger diameters. A few seconds later, the granite began to melt. Granite melts at about 1200 Celsius. Lens, melt granite, then. This is an applicable theory. But an obvious alteration in the form, the shape and the color of the granite is also noticeable. The stone got melted and blackened. It is totally different from the original form of the granite. Other substances like wax keep its form, even after melting, but rocks and granite don't. This is not what we saw with granite monuments that still keep its form and components. They are soft and shiny granite, therefore, can't be melted and poured in molds like wax. This is, apparently, not the method used in cutting and carving. There are two major points that negate the theory of melting fiery stones. First, the heterogeneity of form and color. Second, the unfinished carving. These 2 points are a strong evidence that those stones are carved, not made. On investigating the red granite, for example, one might notice some details that tell us about the naturality of this. Rocks, such as feldspar, white dots in granite, and quartz crystals, which are small transparent crystals similar to glass. Other small black grains are also noticeable in addition to the form of the rock texture, represented on the video, which is one of the most defining characteristics of the type and the form of any stone. All of these elements are widely noticeable in fiery stones in different forms and proportions. They are an unnegotiable sign of the naturality of the stone. If the stone is made or melted, these signatures can't be found. Repeated tiles of artificial granite versus natural granite. Here are some examples, because of the challenging nature of the Serapeum, as well as its tunnels. People suggested that it was built from concrete and its boxes are made from geopolymer. Thus, many challenges can be solved. Digging in the darkness, the heavy stones and the high accuracy of the boxes are curable. It is good to think out of the box, but the fact is that neither the tunnels nor the boxes are made from poured concrete. The Arabian Contractors Company was responsible of the reparation of the tunnels of the Serapeum for 10 years. Engineer Hassan Fahmy was one of the specialists in tunnels and underground constructions. He stated that the company has examined stone samples from the tunnels and ended up proving that they are dug, not made. Some said that the plateau was dug, and the boxes were lowered, then the roof was rebuilt. Still doesn't make sense. This is the normal structure setup for the plateau. No roofs were built, and the boxes were pulled out from the entrance door. The question is, how were they carried inside these tunnels? As for the boxes, the crystals or the lines are quite obvious in the coffins. Sarcophagi in Serapeum, pyramids, and museums all consist of natural texture. Here is one of those boxes left across the passage. It is a proof of a sudden interruption of work at the Serapeum. This box is also a proof of the inaccuracy of the idea of using poured concrete. Is it even logical to pour 70 tons of concrete in the middle of a passage, and find out how to transport it later? It is more logical to pour it in its final location. The throne covers are another proof. If the boxes were poured, then the covers should have been, simply, poured in the final location. This is another unfinished box in the Egyptian Museum. It is another evidence against the idea of artificial stones in statues. We still search, at first place, for the lines or the crystals in the stone. This is the most defining characteristic of artificial stone. It's sometimes tricky, but with neat investigation, you can easily notice the lines and tiles in hundreds and hundreds of statues. Nair is another unfinished statue from the Egyptian Museum. It is quite obvious that the statue was cut as a block of stone, on which carvers are yet to perform. We still do the same thing today. We cut the block, then we work on it. If the statues were poured, they should not have contained these tiles. One might argue that some stones such as the schist are homogeneous without any particles. The statue of Menkaure, the green head, or any other statue, therefore, could be all viewed as made, not curved. No, schist is highly homogeneous in nature. But that who can curve granite, 7 degrees of hardness, can easily carve schist, 4 degrees of hardness. Those who claim that the statues are made, should provide an experimental evidence that the schist statues are made. Obelisks are not an exception. The unfinished obelisk in its quarry, around 1,200 tons. When you closely investigate these obelisks, you will notice the same inscriptions found on the granite. It is the same case with the stony pillars. the stony pots, etc. Fiery stones such as the multiple kinds and degrees of granite are all not subjected to the theory of the geopolymer. Up till now, except of some of the pyramid stones, mentioned up there no single scientific analysis that might prove any of the coffins, the obelisks, the statues, or the pots to be artificial despite being analyzed by Joseph Davidovits, himself, and many others. But it was all in vain. They couldn't find any evidence the idea of the geopolymer was adopted by many as a shortcut justification of the tremendous weights cut and lifted, but it was not that satisfying. Hopefully, I could explain the idea of the artificial stones. The door is still open for more futuristic studies and analyses in this field.